Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where I talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are getting to the end of our Ephesians study, and it's been a blast. But with that being said, we need to figure out what we're going to do next. So if you have a suggestion for the next study we get into, leave a comment, message me, reach out to me. Let me know what you want to cover, what interests you. No guarantees that we're going to do it, but I'm always open to suggestions. So we are in chapter 5 this week. We're going to finish chapter 5. And so we're going to start in verse 21. And this section is one of the more controversial ones in the New Testament. It's one of the ones that a lot of people really just don't like. And it's usually because they think it says things that it doesn't. You know, specifically, we're talking about marriage and how the family's supposed to operate. So before we get too far into it, let's read it, and then we will go from there. So starting in verse 21, it says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." Yeah, so this is one of those passages where people either misunderstand it or they don't like it. So let's look at what it actually says. We need to look at the context, because the world looked very different back then, but at the same time, it kind of looked similar. So the meaning, the principles here that Paul is teaching us, they still apply today. You know, this isn't something that we can just write off as cultural and specifically for those churches in southwest Turkey. But it's also something that there is a cultural context to it. You can't just read it blank. You can't read it at face value and fully understand what it's saying. You need to know the context a little bit here, okay? So starting out, let's look at verse 21, because this is kind of the thesis statement, you know, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is kind of like the thesis for what's about to happen. That means like this is the main idea. Like this is what you should be doing. And then the next several verses, all the way through 6 verse 9, is explaining how that plays out specifically in the household scenario. So amongst your immediate family, amongst kids and parents, amongst servants and stuff like that. If you have servants, that's cool. And even slaves, which hopefully you don't have slaves, and hopefully you aren't a slave. But that's what Paul spends the next section doing, is what is submitting to each other out of reverence for Christ look like. So that's what this is going to be. And it's important to understand what submission is. Now, my brothers growing up, they wrestled in high school and middle school. I did not, because I'm 6'7", and I think I could literally be wrapped up in a knot. I did notice that height helped my brothers. They're shorter than me, but not short. Like they're over 6'3", all of them. But because they were so long, they were able to just, every time someone tried to pin them, they could just keep twisting and keep bending and arching their back. And they never really got pinned unless somebody really, really good, they wrestled them. But, the way that you win a wrestling match like that is by two ways. You either pin somebody, you forcibly get their shoulders to the ground to where they can't get them off the ground, or you put them in some kind of grip, strangle, whatever. Don't strangle, that's against rules. But like you put them in some kind of hold that is painful enough that they submit to you, that they tap, they quit. Submitting is the willful act of acknowledging somebody as your superior, So in the wrestling terms, it's somebody has you in a position that hurts or you just don't want to be in anymore. And so you submit. You say, okay, you win. You cry uncle. What Paul is saying is that we have to submit to Christ. But the difference is with like wrestling, it's a forceful thing, right? Like somebody has forced you to submit. With Jesus, it's not forceful. You have to choose to do it. And then he says you have to choose to submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. So let's look at what that means. Let's look at what it means to submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. I mean, really, we're just doing what Jesus said in John 13:34, where he told us to love one another just as he loved us. Like, that's his new commandment. Love each other as we have been loved. That's what this is. It's really what it is. But it's just, how does that play out in the context of marriage? That's what we're going to look at today. So the cultural context that Paul was writing this passage in is very different, right? First off, you got to look at the three ways people would have understood marriage in his time. We're talking 2,000 years ago, first century, and it was a very multicultural world. You had Jewish people in almost every major city. You had Greek city in every major city, and you had Roman people in every major city. I mean, Romans ruled the world. Greeks educated the world, and Jews taught people about God. Like, that's kind of the way the world worked back then. And so let's look at each one of those groups and how they understood marriage at Paul's day, because it was very different. So the first one, let's look at Paul's view. Paul was Jewish, and so what was the Jewish context of marriage? It starts out with women are legally property. Different time, different culture. Not saying it's right. Matter of fact, I very much disagree with it. Women are not property. But that was the Jewish view. It was women were property. I mean, there was even a Jewish prayer from that time that one of the lines was thanking God that he didn't make me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. Like, they didn't have a very good view of women. Let's just be honest, okay? Let's call it for what it is. It was sexism, okay? But the Jewish view of women is that they were legally property, and that carried over into how marriage was treated amongst Jewish peoples. Not saying that's the way they are today. Don't start, an arms race or get mad at me saying I'm calling all Jews sexist. I'm not at all. But that was the view of the day back then, that women were property, and that carried over. They were the property of the men in their lives, either their fathers or their husbands. Now, compared to other views, Jewish people taught an exceptionally high view of the institution of marriage. It was something to be respected, something that God created. So it's not like they just thought marriage was just, a means to an end. It was something they thought was really important. But how they played that out was really kind of contrary to the spirit of what marriage is. And so, it comes back to Deuteronomy 24:1. This is where we find the Jewish law about divorce, how a marriage can end. And so it says this. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, pay attention to that line, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. Okay, so there are three ways to understand what finding no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency are. Like, there are three ways. There are two big ways that people kind of fell into camps with, and then one weirdo that some people ascribe to. The conservative way was the indecency was adultery only. That was the only reason you could divorce your wife, was if she cheated on you, basically. That was the only reason. The liberal side was any reason. If a man found any reason that his wife did not live up to his expectations, well, he could divorce her. That was kind of the liberal. Those were the two views. It was either adultery only or any reason a guy chose. The third weirdo view was if a guy found a prettier woman, so does not find favor in his eyes. Okay, that was a guy named Akiba, and he was a weirdo. But that was like the third peripheral view that was out there. And so divorce was relatively easy. Like, legally, you didn't have to follow either one of those. Like, legally, the liberal view kind of played out. I mean, you can tell, like, which one were people choosing to follow. It was, if they wanted to get rid of their wife, it was the liberal one. And so all they had to do was go to a rabbi, have them fill out the certificate of divorce, have it signed in front of two witnesses, and hand it to the woman. She done. Nothing she can do about it. Sorry. That's it. That was how divorce worked. It was easy. It was so easy. And so by the time of Paul's day, I mean, divorce was just rampant. It was super easy for Jewish peoples to do. And on the women's side of things, could a woman divorce her husband? Yes, for three reasons. Number one, if he became a leper. Number two, if he became apostate, like he started, being a sinful person in the sense of, like, he stopped worshiping Yahweh, he stopped worshiping the one true God, he started being a pagan or something like that, okay, an apostate, or if he engaged in a disgusting trade. I'll let you figure out what that means. And so I do want you to notice that adultery isn't on that list. Like if the husband cheated, that's not grounds for divorce on the woman's side of things. So you can see how the Jewish view of marriage and divorce kind of was a low in Paul's day, because by that point it was easy to get divorced and women were property, and yeah, it wasn't good. And that's the best view in Paul's day. All right, the next one is how did the Greeks view? And they, like I said, it wasn't any better. The Greeks are actually a little bit worse. They say that a wife's role was purely to serve her husband, to bear legitimate children, and to run the household. That was kind of the Greek view. Now, I want to make a quick caveat here. These views that I'm talking about are generalities. They were kind of the widely held thing, but they weren't universally held. There were exceptions to every rule. Okay, so I just want to be clear before anybody thinks that I'm painting with huge broad strokes. I am, because these are the general views that were had out there. And so if you find exceptions, well, of course, there are exceptions. So, but the Greek view was that women were there to serve. The wife wasn't there for pleasure or companionship. As a matter of fact, there's a quote by a guy named Demosthenes that famously spelled out the role of women in a man's life in the Greek world. And it was that courtesans are for pleasure, concubines are for daily companionship, and wives are for bearing legitimate children and the faithful guardianship of running the household affairs. Women were there to serve while the men focused on their needs. Prostitution was, and it was almost viewed as an essential part of life in the Greek world. So again, the adultery was rampant in the Greek world. And then we get to the Roman view of marriage, and oh my goodness, Roman view was even worse. Like the Roman viewed marriage basically as a means to an end. If you got married, it was expected you got divorced. Again, exceptions to these rules, but for the most part, that was the Roman attitude towards marriage. It was just a contract. There was nothing sacred about it. They might say they were sacred about it. They might write about it, say it was sacred, but and the way it played out in the views of people from this time, the Roman view was that marriage was just, it was a means to an end. And so divorce was everywhere in the Roman world. And then we need to look at our modern view of marriage. The modern view of marriage is kind of like the Roman view, isn't it? Like marriage is a means to an end. I don't think we're quite that detached from the emotional side of it today, but I think that it all plays out kind of the same. Like as long as you're happy and the marriage makes you happy, then it's a good marriage. But if it stops making you happy or you find something better, then it's nothing to get divorced in today's world. I mean, that's just the way that the world views it. There's no stigma attached to divorce like there was 70 years ago. We kind of are very much in that same Roman camp, right? Like that's how we view marriage. It's not sacred. I mean, there again, exceptions to every rule, and if you're a true Christian, you don't view marriage like that at all. And a lot of highly religious people, they don't view marriage like that. But by and large, our society isn't religious anymore. The West is very much secular, and the secular view of marriage is, your truth is your truth. Do what makes you feel good. That's the ultimate goal of everybody's life, right? So yeah, marriage is not viewed very highly in today's world. And so it really gets down to this: the deterioration of gender roles. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole identification politics and all that. Like that's a discussion for another day. But the one thing that we can all agree on and point to and acknowledge, even if you agree with it or disagree with it, is that masculinity has been under attack in the West for a long time. I mean, I'm 32 years old, and I remember as a kid being told by teachers in elementary school that boys should be more like girls because the girls sit still, the girls pay attention, the girls listen. Where the boys are bouncing around, wrestling, being boys. Like I remember those discussions. I don't think the goal of my teachers telling me that was to crush the masculinity in me, but it was kind of the same effect that look at the girls are good, boys are bad, and that's just kind of played out in society in a huge way. The masculine man is not valued at all. It's looked down upon by most of our society. And maybe that's about too broad of a generalization. Maybe it's not most of our society, but a vocal part of our society really thinks that the masculine man is a bad thing. And that's just not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that men and women were created both in God's image, right? Men and women, not just men. men and women, both were created in God's image. Both bear that sacred God likeness, that we all are part of God. God is neither man nor woman. He tells us to refer to him as a man, as a father, but he's not a man. He doesn't have a gender. He's God. And so it's important to remember that, and remember that God created us in his image, both genders, and he created us uniquely. And both unique sides of that are part of who God is. Let that sink in for a second. That God desires community. That he is in perfect community with the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. And that when he created us in his image, he wanted us to be in that perfect unity. And so he created us differently. He created men and women differently, unique. We complement each other. Women have strengths that men don't have. Men have strengths women don't have. We're designed that way, that we're stronger accepting our differences than trying to make sure we all are the same. Now, equality is important. It absolutely is. We all have the same God-given rights. Things like voting and, being paid what we rightfully deserve. All those are good things. We should absolutely have those things. There are things that gender doesn't influence, and in the past it has influenced, okay? I mean, just look at the beginning of this lesson. We talked about the Jewish view of marriage. Sexism is a historically real thing. Like, it happens, okay? I'm not denying that at all. But there's a line there between acknowledging the beauty and the differences between the genders and trying to make sure we're all the same, because we're not. And so when you remove the gender roles in marriage, you start to struggle to understand what Paul is talking about here. Paul is saying that a man has a role in the marriage and the woman has a role in the marriage, and they're not the same role. That's what he's getting at. Now, before we break down exactly what he's talking about there, I do want to mention something that's really interesting. You might not have noticed it. Paul's teaching on marriage changed. Right? He wrote about marriage in the letter that we call 1 Corinthians. It's one of 4 letters that we know he wrote to the church in Corinth, but we only have 2 of them. So the one we call 1 Corinthians, he wrote in chapter 7 about marriage. Now, 1 Corinthians was written roughly 9 years before the Ephesian letter, and Paul's early marriage, and pretty much everybody in the very earliest part of Christianity, like within the first 15, 20 years of Christianity, everybody expected Jesus to come back like any moment, like now kind of deal. And so Paul, when he taught about marriage back then, he wasn't really teaching about marriage. He was trying to tell people how to live their lives while expecting Jesus to be back at any second. And so if you focus on getting married instead of focusing on sharing the gospel, and you've only got a couple years, it might be considered a waste of time. That's why he says, like, if you can help it, don't get married. But if you can't control yourself, get married, because you don't want to, fall into sin either, even though we just have this short time. By the time Paul wrote Ephesians, his view on that had changed. It was obvious to him that Jesus wasn't coming back in like the next 5 minutes kind of deal. And so in Ephesians, we get to see how he really feels about marriage and what he really teaches us about marriage. Whereas in 1 Corinthians, he was more trying to prepare people to focus on being ready for Jesus to come back at any minute, okay? So it's a subtle difference, but if you don't recognize that difference, you can mistreat 1 Corinthians 7 and make it say that marriage is bad when it's not. It's just written in the context of expecting Jesus back at any minute. Ephesians, what we're looking at today, is how do you actually have marriage when Christ could come back at any minute, but you have to live your life anyways. Like, you have to live as though, I don't want to say that as though he's not coming back, because he could come back at any minute, but you live your life as though like you're going to live your full life, that's the balance we all live in, and that's a discussion for another day. But Paul, really what we're getting today is his real teaching on marriage. The other quick caveat is Paul may have been bitter when he wrote 1 Corinthians, and it's not to take away from the value of it, but we're pretty sure one of the requirements to be a member of the Sanhedrin, which we're pretty sure Paul was had to be married. Paul never mentions his wife. And so he may have been bitter. She may have divorced him when he became a Christian. So that's just something to think about. That's not anything in the Bible. We can't prove that. We don't know that for sure. But it does add an interesting flavor to Paul's writing, and it would make sense. But again, that's just conjecture. That's not like, don't look up the verse where Paul says, my wife left me. Like, that's not there. Okay. So let's look at Paul's actual teaching on marriage. Now, up to this point in this letter, he has used the metaphor or the analogy of Christ as the head and the church is his body, right? Like the church is Jesus' tool to bring unity to the world, right? That's the theme of this letter. And this half of the letter specifically is the church is Jesus' tool for bringing unity to the world. And so he takes that same metaphor and applies it to marriage, right? So he's been using it over and over. You should be familiar with it by now. He uses it to describe how the home works, how a marriage works. And he says that in the same way that Jesus is the head of the church, the man is the head of the household. Now that has been taken out of context and used to abuse people for centuries, and God hates that. I mean, I'm just going to be blunt with you. God hates that. That is not what this means. Because nowhere in the Bible does Jesus abuse his authority over the church. Nor does he demand the church serve him. Jesus came to serve, not be served. And so if Paul says that, hey, the man is the head of the household, the same way Jesus is the head of the church, well, the man has to act like Jesus does. And Jesus don't tell us to go make him a sandwich. Just putting that out there. He doesn't do it. Right? Jesus demands big things of us, but they're not things that are selfish. They're not things that are, that are just purely for selfish intent. But Jesus demands that we rise to a higher standard than the world, and that's different. That's not demanding just for the sake of selfishness or laziness or because you have the authority to. As men, yes, you are the head of your household, but that makes you the biggest servant in your household. Right? That's what Paul points to. All the things he says in this passage, that a man, if he is the head of his household, he serves his household. It's a huge responsibility to treat your wife with love and respect, to treat her the way that Christ treats you. That sounds a lot different than being able to demand a sandwich. But that's how so many people take this verse. They want it to say that and they're like pumped about it. Usually it's guys, or it's people who hate that it says that and think that that's, archaic and sexist and God, how dare we be Christians? We're sexist, all of us. And that doesn't say that either. What Paul is telling us to do is, as men, you have to serve. You be the one that gets the sandwich kind of deal, You be the one that takes care of your wife. If you are constantly looking after her, making sure she has what she needs, making sure that she is taken care of above yourself, if you are sacrificially loving her, well, then you're doing what you're supposed to as that household. Jesus washed his disciples' feet, something he should have never done as a rabbi to his disciples. Never. But he did. Jesus died for the church. Something a king doesn't do for his people. But he did. As man, you are supposed to fit that mold. And women, the same is true. I mean, really, this is almost the same command. Yes, you submit to your husband's authority, but that authority is so that he serves. I hope I'm getting that line across, that when it says that a wife submits, it means that she is submitting to her husband as he serves her. If a guy is abusive, if a guy is physically abusive, emotionally abusive, that's not what God desires for your marriage. If somebody's physically abusive, get out, get safe. Like, I will tell people that all day. I think that's exactly what Paul would tell you. I think that's what Jesus would tell you, that if somebody is abusing you, get to safety now. Leave him. There's no room for that, period. And that makes God angry. But that being said, you're supposed to be united together around Christ, serving the world, being the hands and feet of Jesus. Your marriage is supposed to be a picture of Christ and the church. That's what Paul says when he quotes Genesis there at the end, where he says a man should leave his parents, not his wife. Ooh, don't do that. But a man should leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. You should be the same team, united around Christ. That you should be focused together on the same goals of reaching the world with the love of Christ in the context of your daily life. So, all that to say, no, this passage does not say that the man has ultimate authority over his wife and she has to do what he says. It's not what it says. This says that the man should serve his wife and that the wife should submit to his authority. period. Ultimately, marriage works best like that, that we're both trying to take care of each other. We're both putting each other's needs and wants above our own. Then you're going to have a pretty good marriage. But if either party is selfish, yeah, that's when marriages fall apart. So that's my prayer for you, that this hopefully clears up that question, that this isn't a sexist passage, that this isn't demanding that wives be obedient, sit in the corner, speak when spoken to. Like that's not what this says at all. And I hope this clears that up for you, that this actually will help the relationships you have, or if you're not married, that this will give you a better idea of what your marriage should look like. And if you are married, maybe this will help your marriage grow into something that Christ wants it to be. So I hope this was useful, helpful, and et cetera, et cetera. As always, I'll see you next week.